I have a new book out, but more on that later. I somehow never actually saw GoldenEye until just recently. I've seen basically every other Bond film, but just missed it over the years. When watching it, I was struck by two things. How in attempting to modernize the franchise, it nearly became a spoof of itself, and how amazingly good of an adaptation the N64 game is. GoldenEye was released in 1995 and was the 17th Bond film. It was the first not based on the works of Ian Fleming and came after a 6-year hiatus in the Bond franchise. All of these things combined to put added pressure on the franchise to reinvent itself, to modernize for contemporary audiences in the same way that the Daniel Craig Bond films would do 10 years later. The Daniel Craig films are a particularly interesting point of comparison because when modernizing an older franchise, especially one built on pulpy or campy elements, you basically have two choices. You either make it darker, more serious and brooding like Casino Royale, or you go in the opposite direction. You try and make it lighthearted and funny. GoldenEye took the latter approach, often poking fun at itself, its characters, and even its core premise. Characters make fun of the way Bond treats women, of the way he cavalierly kills without consequence, often making jokes or disparaging comments at the main character's expense. This seems like a smart move. It lets audiences know that the writers are aware of how bad these things are as it attempts to update the franchise. We get the joke scene with Q's gadgets to highlight their silliness, Onatopp screaming like a banshee to show how ridiculous Bond women and villains can be, M lamenting Bond's seduction of the therapist, and Natalia, who is at once trying to be a strong, independent character, but also ends up sleeping with Bond like everyone else. There's problems with that. For starters, even though the side characters lament Bond's actions, he doesn't actually change. This isn't a movie where Bond learns not to be a womanizing piece of shit or learns the value of a human life. He categorically doesn't learn either. The other problem is that GoldenEye came out just 2 years before Austin Powers, which goes much farther in its lampooning of the Bond legend, leaving many of GoldenEye's jokes falling flat by comparison. In many ways, GoldenEye is about how Bond is the same. It's the world that has changed. But Austin Powers was able to take that same concept much farther by leaning completely into comedy. Don't get me wrong, GoldenEye is certainly a fun movie, and it has easily the best line in any Bond film.
It's too easy. Half of everything is luck, James. And the other half? Fate.
It also made a pretty damn good video game. I loved GoldenEye as a child. I can still remember with fondness the Christmas my brother and I got our N64 along with a copy of the game. Having not seen the movie, I just took the game at face value as a surprisingly good first-person shooter on the consoles of the era. At the time, I was able to recognize how clever much of its design was, and we all loved its multiplayer. But it's only now, as an adult, having seen the movie, that I can recognize how good of an adaptation it is. Adaptation doesn't just mean doing something in a different medium, it means altering the work to fit the strengths and avoid the weaknesses of said medium. Sometimes that means doing what amounts to a shot-for-shot recreation, allowing the skill of the actors to bring characters to life that only existed on the page. And other times it means cutting out some of the longer, more contemplative sections to focus on action and spectacle. The N64 was not a powerful machine, and cutscenes from the era are primitive at best. First-person shooters were effectively non-existent on consoles at the time, making Rare's challenge considerable when setting out to make this title. Remember that when faced with a design challenge, the canvas is blank, the possibilities limitless. They could have made anything, and what they ended up making was a damn fine video game. Because we're talking about the adaptation, I really just want to focus on the single-player campaign. The multiplayer was revolutionary on consoles for its time, but it's the campaign where I see real skill. The difficulty options being based around additional objectives, forcing the player to master the level and fully utilize their tools is brilliant, rather than simply making the enemies tougher as most games do. I love that they reuse Facility and Severnaya in clever ways, adding levels while under the constraints of limited cartridge space. But the real skill here is how they manage to evoke mini sequences from the film while still keeping the gameplay first and foremost. Remember, movie tie-in games from that era tended to be a heaping pile of garbage. Most were completed under very tight deadlines and were barely functional, let alone fun. But the developers of GoldenEye used the sequences from the movies as inspiration, as guidelines, and then built an interesting game around it. This is apparent right from the start of the game. Look at the dam level where the game opens. In the movie, all we get is this. Yet in the game, they turn it into an entire, albeit small, introductory level to help the player get used to the game. It still follows the plot from the movies, but does so in a way that enhances the strength of the medium. All the major beats from the movie are there, including the mission with 006, the statue park, the interrogation at the library, even the tank level and the jungle fight with Onatop all make it in. They even keep the opening toilet sequence. It's clear at every turn the makers of this game had a real appreciation for the film. But what's even more impressive is the changes they made to make a better game without taking away from the story or tone of the movie. Frigate is probably the best example of this. In the movie, it is completely different. Pierce Brosnan shoots his way onto a yacht, notices the helicopter in the distance, and then gets stopped by a bunch of guards. Hardly a sequence that would make for exciting gameplay. It takes what would have been a lame level, or at best an underwhelming cutscene, and turns it into what I think is one of the game's best levels. Certainly at one I loved playing over and over again as a kid. Instead of a party like in the movie, it's a tense hostage situation, complete with bombs that need to be defused. Remember the other week when I said I was trying to get better about the whole hostage thing? Or which person in your group keeps shooting hostages because they have an itchy trigger finger? In our group, I was always that guy, but I'm getting better about it. Well, about that. The point being that it takes the same purpose as the movie, trying to get the tracker onto the helicopter, and adapts it to something more befitting of the game. The same can be said for the game's now iconic train level, another personal favorite, and one so good it's still influencing developers today.
The way I hear it, this used to be some kind of KGB black site. Mobile missile launch control center, prison transport, your guess is as good as mine. But at one point, it appears to have been the HQ of Janus, the Cold War spy master.
It's no wonder IO are making their next game one about James Bond. GoldenEye is a really interesting time capsule, a focal point for media studies. On the one hand, it's a perfectly serviceable Bond film, if not a bit silly but otherwise forgettable action movie. And on the other hand, it's a beloved game and arguably the best movie tie-in game ever made. This isn't a Gimnop episode, so it doesn't really make sense for me to end it by telling you to go play GoldenEye. But go play GoldenEye. That game's amazing. I have a new book out. It's called Trial of Atlas. It's a drama about a murder, and I put a lot of work into it and would really appreciate it if you gave it a shot. It's available now on Amazon Kindle and Google Play. If you want to support the channel, consider picking up it or one of my many other stories. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.